In the late Roman Republic, the rich and powerful were obsessed with one thing: getting more power. With all the corruption and infighting, it seemed like Rome was destined for decline. But that's when a new kind of Roman started to emerge: ambitious, energetic, and relentless. And this new breed would produce two giants, two men whose rivalry would shape Rome forever. But today we meet the first of these giants. We are going to go back almost 200 years to see how a young man born into obscurity seized control of Rome and became its most powerful magistrate, a position that would set him up for greatness or doom. Our story begins in the year 133 BC, right in the middle of the late Roman Republic, a period of about 200 years between the end of the Macedonian Wars and the beginning of the empire. It was an age of great troubles and also great ambitions. The Republic had grown huge, but now its size was causing problems. Its diverse regions and far-flung provinces were hard to govern and harder to defend. Meanwhile, in the late Republic, the rich and powerful were obsessed with just one thing: getting more power. This led to lots of corruption and even more infighting. And so, by the time our story starts, Rome was already looking pretty unstable. And yet some saw an opportunity in all this chaos. These were the new breed of Romans: ambitious, energetic, and relentless. They were often called populars, which literally means people's man, but actually means politician who supports the common people. That's what they wanted to be called anyway. And the first of these new breed of Romans was Gaius Marius. There isn't much documentation about Marius's early life. Most of what we know comes from the writings of Plutarch and Cimbri, who both wrote at least 1,000 years after Marius lived. So while we can't be 100% sure if every detail is true, most scholars agree that Marius was born in the Italian countryside in 157 BC. His father was a small landowner, and when he died, he left Marius and his brothers a modest inheritance. This made Marius technically a member of the equestrian class, the second highest social class in Roman society after the Senate. But financially, he wasn't that different from a peasant. He owned a couple of farms and some slaves, and that was it. So when Marius decided to move to Rome and pursue politics, he didn't have much money, and he certainly wasn't well connected. In fact, he probably didn't even know anyone in the Senate. This meant that if he wanted to get ahead, he wouldn't be able to rely on his family connections or wealth. Instead, he would have to make a name for himself. And he would do this in the military. The way the Roman political system worked, a man could get a lot of attention very quickly by getting a successful military command. So that's what Marius did. He campaigned in various parts of the Republic, mostly in the province of Hispania. This is where he got the nickname Marius the Great. Historians aren't exactly sure what he accomplished during these campaigns, but they do know that he was successful. After a few years of campaigning, he returned to Rome a local hero, and this set him up for the next phase of his career. You see, when a Roman went on a military campaign, there were three possible outcomes. You could win a big victory and earn lots of glory. You could lose badly and earn lots of shame. Or you could just come back home without making any lasting impact whatsoever. Marius had done something quite rare. He'd managed to find the perfect middle ground. He hadn't lost any battles, but he hadn't really won any either. This meant he was eligible for one of the highest positions in Roman politics, the consulship. As a consul, he would be in charge of running the Republic for 1 year, alongside another consul. It was a prestigious job with lots of responsibilities, but it was also very dangerous, because it came with the expectation that you would lead Rome into war. Now, normally, you needed to be a senator to become consul, but the rules were changed for Marius. It wasn't even the first time. In fact, he was the third consul in a row who wasn't a senator. This trend shows how volatile politics were in late Republican Rome. But it also shows how respected Marius was by his peers. Anyway, in 119 BC, Marius was elected consul. That same year, he appointed Lucius Cornelius Sulla as his subordinate in the consulship. If you've been watching this series since episode 1, then you might recognize that name. That's right. We're finally starting to see the two greatest rivals in Roman history. This was the first time they worked together, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the course of their careers, they served together in 3 different consulships. What they accomplished during their first term as consuls is not very important to our story. What is important is that they got another consulship the following year. Now, this was unheard of at the time. No one had ever held the consulship for 2 years in a row. The position was supposed to be temporary, but Marius and Sulla had convinced the other magistrates to let them serve another year. Now, you might be wondering why they wanted to do this. It is because the previous year they had been appointed consuls to deal with a crisis in the province of Asia Minor. Rome had gone to war against the kingdom of Pontus, and things were not going well. So Marius and Sulla asked to be appointed commanders of the army instead of consuls. This was agreed upon, and Marius and Sulla marched their armies across Italy to meet the Pontic threat. There, they met another Roman general named Archimedes, who was doing a terrible job. Marius and Sulla defeated him. But their victory led to a disagreement over credit. Archimedes claimed he should get all the glory, because he was older and more experienced than Marius and Sulla. But Marius argued that he and Sulla were the real heroes because they had saved the Republic from defeat. Anyway, while all this was going on, Rome was being taken over by a group of aristocrats led by a man named Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Why? Well, in 118 BC, it was the turn of the Senate to appoint consuls, but Marius and Sulla weren't finished campaigning, so they refused to give up their commands. The Senate didn't like this, so they appointed a new consul, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. But he was actually more radical than the Senate. He took advantage of his authority as consul to start undermining Marius and Sulla. For example, he took control of the public treasury and stopped sending money to Marius and Sulla's armies. He also attempted to end their consulships early so that new elections could be held. So what did Marius and Sulla do? They marched their armies on Rome itself. It was the first time ever that Roman generals had brought their armies into the city. Cinna tried to resist, but in the end, Marius and Sulla forced him to flee, and with that Marius's political career took off. He was appointed consul again in 117 BC, but this wasn't the high point of his career. The pinnacle of his political success would come in the next chapter. If you want to find out how many times Marius would be appointed consul, you'll have to stay tuned. But if you want to hear more about ancient Rome right now, then I recommend checking out my podcast. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Bye. This is chapter 2 of my alternate history of Rome. If you've not seen chapter 1 yet, please go check it out first. We open today's episode in the year 89 BC in a small town called Arpinum, located in central Italy, just south of the confluence of the river Taras and the Anio. Arpinum was just another provincial town to the Romans, a place that didn't even have its own senator, but which nonetheless played a vital role in shaping the future of Rome. For it was here that a boy named Marius was born into modest circumstances, though not poverty, to a father who would give him the name of the absent deity, Deus Salus, or God alone. This Marius would grow up to be a man of humble beginnings and few connections. Yet he would rise through the ranks of Roman society to become one of the most powerful men in all of Italy, and eventually the world. And while the details of Marius' early life are sketchy at best thanks to the holes in Plutarch's biography of him, what we do know provides an interesting look at the man that he was and the roots from which he drew his strength. Marius grew up in a small house with his parents, bought freedmen and 4 siblings, 3 brothers and a sister. His father, also named Marius, had been a freed slave who chose to keep his original name rather than take on a new one, like many freedmen did. The family was probably not rich, but they were by no means destitute either. They owned their own home and slaves, indicating that they were comfortably middle class. And young Marius' grandfather had actually been an equestrian from Pisa. Now this is where things get interesting, because in Republican Rome there were 3 main classes. The first was the patrician nobility, made up of the hereditary elite families that traced their lineage back to the founding of the city in 753 BC in Tisicon. Was the equestrian class, a sort of wealthy middle class that served as the backbone of Rome's armies, tax collection system, and provincial administration. Below them were the plebeians, common folk, who could be anything from merchants to artisans to farmers. Marius, you see, was not a patrician. Far from it. In fact, he wasn't even a Roman citizen for that matter, at least at first. But his grandfather's status as an equestrian meant that Marius was unexactly poor by any stretch of the imagination, either. He was basically what we would call a landed gentleman farmer. But more importantly, he was free. free from the shackles of slavery and free to pursue whatever opportunities presented themselves to him. The equestrian class was actually pretty complicated. It was not a rigid hereditary class like the patricians. But it was also not entirely open like the class system that would develop later on in imperial Rome. The easiest way to join the equestrian order was simply to be born into it, typically as the son of a wealthy farmer. The only problem was that unlike the other two classes, being an equestrian carried no official political rights. You couldn't vote, hold public office, or really do much of anything unless you were a Roman citizen. As a result, some equestrians, especially those without a noble background, chose to seek citizenship through military service. Others bought their way in with money, usually by funding a lavish public project that impressed the people enough to grant them citizenship. And the lucky few managed to marry into old Roman families, gaining citizenship through marriage instead of birth. Regardless of how they got it, though, if a man was a Roman citizen and met certain property requirements, then he could theoretically hold any office in the state. So what kind of childhood did young Marius have? Again, the sources are spotty at best, but we do know that he grew up on a farm in the countryside near Arpinum. We also know that his father died when he was still a child and that he was raised primarily by his mother. The exact nature of Marius' personality during these formative years is unknown, but we can glean a few clues from the stories Plutarch tells us about his adulthood. He must have been a disciplined person, given his obsessive focus on physical fitness, simple in his tastes, given his lifelong frugality, and ambitious in character, given the lengths he would go to achieve his goals. Most historians agree that he was also a deeply religious man who took great pains to honor the traditional Roman gods, and downplayed his famous affair with a priestess of Apollo, perhaps because he was genuinely embarrassed by it, perhaps because he wanted to protect his reputation, or perhaps because doing so would violate the sacred oath he had sworn to uphold the dignity of his adopted city. Whatever the reason, we can safely say that Marius was a devout and pious man despite his somewhat scandalous past. Now, considering his equestrian background, it is likely that Marius received a private education at home, until he was around 12 or 13 years old, at which point he would have gone to Rome to receive further training in rhetoric and law. Like most upper-class Roman boys, he would have studied subjects like poetry and philosophy as well, and would have spent his summers learning how to manage his father's farm and estate. At this point, it's worth mentioning that according to Roman custom, his mother would have remained his legal guardian throughout his life, since women in ancient Rome couldn't own property, so she would have formally managed his affairs while he traveled. At some point, Marius would have entered the military as a young officer in one of Rome's legions. This would have been a formative experience for him, instilling in him the values of discipline, obedience, and duty. Much has been made of the fact that Marius was unusually tall for the time period, standing at around 6 feet 2 inches. Plutarch even goes so far as to say that he was unusually handsome. However, there is zero evidence for this claim, save for a single passing comment from the 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who described Marius as having been a good-looking guy. We also have no idea how tall people actually were back then, since the ancient measurements for height are wildly inaccurate and very wildly depending on who you ask. What we do know, however, is that Marius was considered lean and muscular, almost to the point of being emaciated. Appian, a historian from the 2nd century AD, describes him as being thin and wiry, while Plutarch mentions that he was often sick from exposure to cold. All of this is to say that Marius was probably pretty scrawny, and I do want to think anyone would have confused him for being the most handsome guy at the gladiator games. In any case, after a few years of military service, Marius would have returned to Arpinum to run his family's farm and settle down. He would have married a local girl, probably around the age of 18 Ordius and Wavy, and together they would have had several children, the oldest of whom would have been a son named Gaius Marius, the younger. During this time, Marius would have attended the local assemblies and courts, gaining experience in public life and making connections that would help him advance his career. This is where he would have honed his skills as a speaker and politician, learning how to persuade and negotiate. While running his farm, he would have also continued to train as a soldier, perhaps taking up arms against the local bandits, and would have kept in close contact with his old military friends, keeping abreast of events in the wider world. By the time he was in his late 20s, Marius was ready for bigger things, so he left his farm in the hands of his wife and set off for Rome. There, he threw himself into public life, throwing the full weight of his considerable personality behind various public projects. He gained popularity among the common folk with his boisterous energy and optimistic speeches about the future of Rome, but he was looked down upon by the elite, whose entrenched interests he threatened by advocating for reform. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. Gaius Marius was elected tribune of the plebs. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and come back next week for Chapter 3. See you then. Chapter 3. Early military service and rise. Under Scipio. The year is 134 BCE. Rome has been fighting a brutal war against Jugurtha, king of Numancia, for years, and Gaius Marius, a young military tribune, finds himself at the siege of the city of Numancia. It's been 2 years since he first arrived here with his legion, and they have yet to make any headway. As the Romans struggle to dislodge the stubborn Numantines from their city walls, Marius sees firsthand the toll that it takes on his fellow soldiers. Men become demoralized and exhausted, refusing to fight and longing for the comforts of home. The siege is becoming more and more difficult, and there is talk of abandoning the campaign altogether. One day, Marius sees an opportunity to help turn the tide of the battle. He approaches his superior officer with a plan to attack the city from a different angle, believing that they will be successful if they can catch the Numantines by surprise. But his idea is rejected, and he watches as his men continue to suffer defeat after defeat. Despondent and discouraged, Marius decides to leave the army and return to Rome, where he hopes that he can at least enjoy some peace of mind. But when he gets back, he finds that things are not what he expected. The people of Rome are angry about the war, blaming the generals for their inability to defeat the Numantines, and Marius finds himself drawn back into the conflict. Desperate to find a way to contribute to the war effort, Marius throws himself into studying military strategy, determined to come up with a plan that will finally bring the war to an end. He pores over maps and battle plans, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of both the Roman and Numantine armies. He knows that something has to be done quickly before more lives are lost. After weeks of intense study, Marius comes up with a daring plan to invade the heartland of Numancia, believing that this will force the king to choose between defending his capital or his homeland. He presents his plan to the Senate, who are impressed by his boldness and give him command of a small force to test out his strategy. With a small force at his command, Marius sets out to prove himself, and the Senate right. He leads his men on a daring campaign through enemy territory, avoiding ambushes and skirmishes with Numantine forces, until he reaches the center of the kingdom. There he issues a challenge to Jugurtha, demanding that he surrender the city or face the full force of the Roman army. Jugurtha refuses to back down, and Marius finds himself in a precarious position. Outnumbered and outgunned, he knows that he cannot win a direct confrontation with the Numantine king. So he does the unthinkable. He turns around and heads back to Rome, realizing that he needs more support if he wants to stand a chance against Jugurtha. Marius sets about assembling the largest army Rome has ever seen. He drills his men relentlessly, pushing them to their limits to ensure that they are prepared for the battle ahead. And when they are ready, he marches them back to Numancia, determined to finish what he started. Upon his return to Numancia, Marius lays siege to the city once again. This time, he is prepared. He has brought enough supplies to sustain his men for months, and he has studied the city's defenses to find its weak points. His plan is simple, but effective. He will starve the city into submission, rather than risk losing his men in a costly assault. Days turn into weeks, and the Numantine resistance begins to crumble. Their food supplies dwindle, and the citizens grow weaker. Finally, after a grueling siege, Jugurtha and his men are forced to surrender. Marius had done it. He had finally defeated the Numantines and brought the war to an end. Relief and elation spread through the Roman ranks as they celebrated their hard-won victory. But despite the cheers of his fellow soldiers, Marius couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had achieved victory, yes, but at what cost? The war had been long and bloody, and the city of Numancia lay in ruins around him. He knew that there would be no glory in this victory, and that the true cost of war was the loss of life and the destruction of entire civilizations. As the celebrations died down and the reality of his victory sunk in, Marius began to wonder what the future held for him. He had proven himself to be a capable general, but he knew that there would always be those who questioned his authority. He would need to be cautious if he wanted to maintain his power and influence in the years to come. Not long after the war ended, Marius returned to Rome as a hero. The people cheered his name and praised his bravery as he rode through the streets in his chariot. But beneath the surface, he knew that there were many who saw him as a threat, a man who had risen too high and might one day become a danger to the Republic. He knew that he needed to be careful if he wanted to protect his reputation and secure his place in Roman society. As the years passed, Marius continued to climb the ladder of success in Rome, but he never forgot the lessons he learned during the war. He carried the weight of the people's expectations on his shoulders, knowing that every decision he made could either solidify his legacy or bring it crashing down around him. He worked tirelessly to earn the trust of the Senate and the people, always aware of the dangers of ambition and the importance of maintaining balance in a world of chaos. Through it all, he remained humble, remembering the hardships he had endured and the sacrifices that had been made to secure his victories. In the midst of this political maneuvering, a new assignment came calling, one that would change Marius' life forever. He was ordered to serve under the legendary general Scipio Aemilianus, who was renowned for his tactical brilliance and his ability to lead his troops to victory. For Marius, this was a golden opportunity to learn from the best and hone his own skills as a general. He knew that serving under Scipio would be an honor and a privilege, but he also knew that it would be a challenging and demanding assignment. Still, he was eager to prove himself, and he accepted the assignment with enthusiasm. As Marius joined Scipio's army, he was struck by the level of discipline and efficiency that pervaded the ranks. Scipio was known for his strict adherence to military protocol, and his soldiers were trained to respond quickly and decisively to any situation. Marius watched in admiration as they executed maneuvers with precision and grace, each soldier knowing his role and carrying out his orders without hesitation. He found himself drawn to Scipio's leadership style, which was a combination of firmness, intelligence, and compassion. Scipio was a brilliant strategist, able to anticipate his opponent's moves and exploit their weaknesses, but he was also a kind and empathetic leader who cared about the well-being of his soldiers. Marius observed how Scipio treated his men, how he listened to their concerns and tried to address their needs, and he began to understand the secret behind Scipio's success. It wasn't just his military skills or his strategic brilliance that made him such a great general. It was also his ability to lead by example and inspire his soldiers to be their best. Marius learned from Scipio the importance of discipline, strategy, and compassion in leadership. He saw how Scipio's ability to unite his soldiers and inspire them to fight for a common goal had led them to victory in countless battles, and he resolved to emulate his mentor's example. As he rose through the ranks of the Roman army, one day, while watching his men train, Scipio turned to Marius and said something that would change Marius' life forever. "There's nothing in this man that's common," he said, gesturing towards one of Marius' soldiers, a man who had shown exceptional courage and skill in battle. At first, Marius didn't understand what Scipio meant, but as he watched the soldier perform, he began to see what Scipio was talking about. This man was not like the others. He had a certain fire in his eyes, a determination and drive that set him apart. Scipio continued, "This man has something special, a spark of greatness. If he is given the right opportunities and guidance, he could become a great leader one day." Marius thought about Scipio's words as he watched the soldier finish his training exercise. He realized that Scipio was right. There was something special about this man, something that set him apart from the other soldiers. From that day on, Marius took the young soldier under his wing, providing him with the guidance and training he needed to hone his skills and reach his full potential. He saw in the young soldier a reflection of himself, a reminder of his own journey to greatness, and the importance of recognizing and nurturing talent in others. Marius knew that the young soldier was destined for great things, and he was proud to have played a part in helping him on his path to becoming a legendary figure in Roman history. Over the years, Marius continued to rise through the ranks, eventually becoming a consul himself. He went on to win many more battles and achieve great victories, all while keeping in mind the lessons he learned from Scipio. He never forgot the importance of discipline, strategy, and compassion in leadership, and he always looked for ways to nurture the talent of the young soldiers under his command. And the young soldier whom Scipio had singled out for greatness became one of Marius' closest friends and most trusted advisors serving by his side through thick and thin and playing a key role in many of Marius' greatest victories. Together, they went on to become legendary figures in Roman history, their names forever linked by their shared experiences, and their common goal of making Rome the greatest power in the ancient world. Alright, welcome back to Rome. It's me, and in Chapter 4, we are going to climb the political ladder with our boy Marius. As you may recall from our last episode, he's just been elected consul for the year 107 BC, but he was also elected for 106. So he has 2 years in this top office. But that doesn't mean it's smooth sailing ahead. He still has to get through those elections, and he's gonna have some stiff competition. Let's jump in with our man Marius. Now he is able to secure his first consulship in large part, because he is able to pay the election expenses for his supporters. But that doesn't mean he's flush with cash. In fact, he's pretty much living paycheck to paycheck here, funding his campaigns by borrowing money from rich Romans. Which means, once he's in office, he's got to do right by them or else they won't support him again. At the same time, though he can't ignore the expectations of the people, who want him to be just as tough on the Samaritans as he was on the Teutones. And so, how does he square that circle? Well, by promising both groups a big show, he sets out to build roads, aqueducts, temples, and other public works, all of which require lots of manpower and material. And he's going to need allies to get these projects rolling. So, where does he turn to? Well, 2 men who might seem like odd bedfellows. Gaius Gracchus and Lucius Appuleius Saturninus. Let's talk about them one at a time. First, there's Gaius. Remember him? Crazy, radical land reformer who tried to take over the government in 133 BC, but was assassinated before he could do anything. Well, he has a brother named Lucius, and he's looking to make Marius' new land reform program a reality. Not the audacious kind that Gaius was proposing, but if Gaius wanted to tear down the old system, Lucius wants to tweak it and fix the parts that are broken. He's a lot more moderate than his brother, but no less determined, and he sees Marius as the perfect ally to get things done. The problem is, Lucius is a former consul, which means he's a senator. And Marius, well, he's not. He's a new man, a self-made man, but he's not part of the ruling class. And that makes working together a bit tricky because it turns out that senators don't really like working with non-senators. They think they're better than them, and sure, in most cases, they probably are. But sometimes their noses get so far up their own behinds that they forget the good work that the non-senators are doing. And that's what happened with Lucius. He decided to look past the snobbery and endorse Marius anyway. It was a controversial decision, but it paid off. The two worked together to pass laws redistributing public land to poor citizens and veterans of the social war. They created new colonies in Italy and reformed the courts. Lucius helped set up a legal defense fund for Italians who couldn't afford lawyers. He pushed for restrictions on slavery, too, and did his best to make life better for everyone in Rome. Unfortunately, he would not live to see the results of his efforts. He died midway through Marius' first consulship, but his death paved the way for even greater things. And it brings us to our next ally, Appuleius Saturninus, the last of our 3, and in many ways the most important. You see, Appuleius comes from a family of former slaves who were freed by the first consul, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Now, you may remember him as the bad guy from our episode about the First Mithridatic War. But back in 100 BC, he was a rising star in Roman politics, ambitious and ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to get ahead, which is why when he hears about Marius' plan to build roads and aqueducts and all those other infrastructure projects, he sees an opportunity. Here's a guy who wants to get things done, a guy who needs allies, and I know just how to help him. Now, you might be thinking, wait, didn't Marius just borrow money from rich Romans to fund his campaigns? Yeah, he did. And Appuleius is one of those creditors. But here's the thing. Appuleius isn't just lending Marius money out of the goodness of his heart. No, he wants something in return, and he wants it in writing. In fact, he demands a written contract guaranteeing him lucrative government jobs, road construction jobs, basically anything that will line his own pockets. And Marius agrees. The terms of their deal vary depending on the source, but according to Plutarch, it goes like this. Appuleius will give Marius 100 talents of silver, about $2 million today, for the lictor, which is the governor of one of Rome's provinces, and the governorship of a colony. So not exactly a great deal. But Marius is already deep in debt. He's desperate for help. And besides, he's got 2 years as consul. He thinks he can get away with it. And sure enough, he gets the votes he needs to start his building projects. And then he appoints Apuleius to the coveted post of curator aquarum, which oversees Rome's water supply. That's the theory. Anyway, in practice, it doesn't go quite as smoothly. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that Apuleius is already neat in a scandal involving the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. If you want to know more about that, I've got a whole video on it. Just click right here. But the long story short is that Apuleius is trying to keep his distance from any controversy. So he asks his friend Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus to replace him as curator aquarum. Now, you may know Magnus as Pompey the Great. He's famous, too. But back in 107 BC, he's a young man without much experience in government. And sure enough, the job is a little too much for him. And here's why. See, it turns out that some of the water channels in Rome are blocked, and that means no water for bathing, drinking, or flushing toilets. That's a pretty big deal in ancient Rome. And it has not gone na make Marius. Very popular with the voters if he doesn't fix it. And the only way to clear the aqueducts is with a gang of slaves who have only been paid in months. Now, normally, you can just threaten to whip them into shape. But they've all banded together and they say they won't work unless they get their wages. Pompey doesn't know what to do. And that's when Marius steps in and solves the whole problem by bribing the slaves instead. He pays them, the aqueduct gets cleared, and order is restored to Roman life. But while that's a big win for Marius, his other choice for lictor doesn't work out nearly as well. You see, the lictor's job is to collect taxes for Rome, and Marius chooses a senator named Gaius Marius to do the job for him. But Cyrus has some funny ideas about collecting taxes. For example, he likes to take a cut for himself. He squeezes the people he's supposed to be helping, and when that gets around, people get pretty mad. Then he starts extorting wealthy landowners in the countryside, demanding protection money from them. And when that fails, he starts arresting people and accusing them of crimes against the state. So yeah, unsurprisingly, people get pretty mad about that, too. And eventually the Senate grows so tired of Cicero's shenanigans that they tell Marius he has to pick someone else. To make a long story short, none of Marius's handpicked candidates can actually do the job. So he ends up sending none other than Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And now here's where things get really interesting. See, Marius had no idea he was appointing Sulla to be his deputy. But Sulla takes full advantage of the situation. He collects taxes efficiently and dutifully, sends the money back to Rome. Then he goes back to the city with the rest of the Roman army after the social war ends. He stays out of politics for a while, keeping a low profile, saving his money, making valuable contacts and waiting for his chance to strike. So that's what happens in Marius's first consulship. His building projects start out strong but lose momentum due to infighting. His deputies fail him. The only bright spot is the end of the social war. He marches into Athens to a hero's welcome and helps negotiate the peace treaty with the Italian allies. He returns to Rome to the cheers of the populace, and all in all, he's got a pretty successful first year as consul. But the second year, well, that's when things get really exciting. So stay tuned until next week to find out what happens. When we come back, we're going to talk about Catiline's conspiracy and Cicero's famous speech against him. But if you want to get a head start on that, I've got another channel where I read and discuss classical works of literature. We just started Catiline, and if you want to join us, all you have to do is click right here and subscribe. In the meantime, I'm going to keep working on getting our audiobooks finished. So if you want to hear more about the history of Rome, all you have to do is click right here and become a member. Members get access to our exclusive content, including our audiobook series, where I read primary sources about Roman history. This month, we're reading Augustine's City of God, and we just finished book 1. And we've got tons more content coming your way, so don't miss out. Join our membership today. I'll see you next week. Welcome to Chapter 5 of our series, where Caesar met his wife. In this series, we are reading through Plutarchus' life of Caesar and discussing how he became the most powerful man in the ancient world. We've covered chapters 1 through 4 here, but you can also find the entire series on our website. Now, let's get into it. So in the last episode, we left off with Caesar about to marry Cleopatra. Now, instead of actually getting married to her, he travels to meet another woman named Julia. Who is she? Why is he going to marry her, and why does this matter for Caesar? Well, let's read Plutarch's text to find out. Chapter 5 opens with Caesar traveling to meet Julia. She is staying with her grandmother, Julia Misa, at a villa near Brindisi. As Caesar approaches, everyone comes out to greet him, including Julia. There's something interesting here because Plutarch pauses to describe Julia's beauty, saying that even though she was not exceptionally attractive, she was pretty in appearance and manner and behavior. And that's important because when describing women in Roman literature, there are two ways to go about it. You can either focus on their physical beauty, or you can talk about their good character and virtue. Typically, you don't see both of these things together. But Plutarch says that Julia had both physical beauty and moral virtue. This is an indication that Caesar has done well for himself by marrying into this family. And speaking of family, the first thing Caesar does after greeting Julia is to visit her grandmother Julia Misa. As I explained in the last episode, Misa is the mother of Caesar's great uncle, Julius Caesar. But what's interesting here is that she is also the grandmother of the future Emperor Augustus. As Plutarch puts it, so by this marriage tie, Caesar was connected with the descendants of both the founders of the Julian and the Caesar families. That future connection through his daughter Julia with Augustus will be explored more in future episodes. It's really fascinating to see how these early relationships set up the future of Rome. But for now, let's get back to the present and see how people are reacting to Caesar's presence. At the same time, Caesar is visiting Julia's grandmother. News reaches them that Sextus Pompey has arrived in Brundisium with ships to take Julia back to Rome. Sextus Pompey is the brother of Caesar's ally Gnaeus Pompey. He's come to escort Julia back to her new husband, but little did he know Caesar would beat them there. Now, because of Caesar's impressive reputation, which preceded him from his victories in Gaul, Sextus Pompey regrets not being the one to welcome Caesar in person, rather than sending word ahead of time for Caesar to come to him. And this is a sign of how much Caesar has grown in power and prestige, so much so that even Pompey feels intimidated by him. Sextus Pompey then accompanies Caesar back to his ship, where they have dinner together and spend the night before departing the next day. Once they leave, Julia stays behind with her grandmother, Caesar's mother, Aurelia Cata, and her freedwoman Charia, who will play an important role later. As they sail away, a storm arises. But Caesar remains calm, while those around him panic. This demonstrates his inner strength and self-control, something he learned from his grandfather, the dictator. Back in Rome, his friends are celebrating his return. When Caesar arrives, he goes to the house of his father's freedman, Titus Labienus, where he finds his friend Crassus, and together they sacrifice to the household gods. While Caesar is praying, Labienus tells Crassus to look at Caesar's hands and observe how pure and white they are, indicating that Caesar is a man of peace, a man of letters, and not a common soldier who works with his hands. Cassius remarks that even his hands reveal the kind of man he is. Later, Labienus reveals to Cassius that he has been given orders by Caesar to marry his daughter Julia. Now, if you remember from the last episode, Caesar has already married Cleopatra, but that marriage never made it back to Rome. So he is still looking for a Roman bride, and who better than his great-aunt's granddaughter, Julia, the perfect Roman aristocrat, to cement his position in high society. The next day Caesar goes to visit the temple of Bellona, the goddess of war, which has been closed for a long time, and he opens it again. This is significant because, as Plutarch explains, the fact that he opened the temple of Bellona shows that he was a man of war, although he did not need to show this by waging wars since his victories in Gaul had made his reputation secure. Again, this emphasizes Caesar's strong reputation, even without having to start any new conflicts. Instead, he prefers to appear pious and religious by reopening the temple to the public. Then Caesar goes to visit Pompey, and they exchange greetings and pleasantries. Pompey then leaves for his farm to prepare for the sacrifices and celebrations that will take place the following day in honor of Caesar. Here we see that despite their close relationship, there is still some tension between Caesar and Pompey. They maintain a certain distance and formality in their interactions. Perhaps Pompey feels threatened by Caesar's growing popularity and influence. Maybe he sees Caesar as a potential rival rather than an ally. Or perhaps he's simply cautious and wants to avoid any accusations of impropriety. Later that evening, Caesar attends a gladiatorial performance hosted by Pompey. Among the spectators is Marcus Junius Brutus, the son of Servilia, who we met in the previous episode. When Caesar notices him, he invites Brutus over to watch the games from his private box. And this is important because Brutus will become a central figure in Caesar's assassination and his legacy. So this meeting marks the beginning of their relationship. The next day, the Vestal Virgins perform their sacred rites in the Temple of Vesta, and Caesar offers a prayer for victory in the upcoming civil war against Pompey. The next day, the Lupercalia festival takes place, which honors the she-wolf that supposedly nursed Romulus and Remus. Caesar, along with other magistrates, participates in the traditional goat sacrifice during the festival. Later, he is dragged by his friends to the theater where a comedy called The Eunuch is performed. During the play, Caesar recognizes Publius, a former slave of his father who was freed along with his brother, and he gives the old man money and a cloak as a gift. At the end of the chapter, we find out that Caesar is going to marry Julia, the granddaughter of his great-uncle, Gaius Caesar, and the future grandmother of Augustus. Through this marriage, Caesar solidifies his ties to the most important families in Rome, the Iuli and the Caesars. But this is not just a strategic move to increase his prestige. Plutarch also hints at a genuine affection between Caesar and Julia, as well as a deep sense of duty and piety towards his family and ancestors. So, what do you think? What is the significance of marrying into the Iuli Caesar's family? And how does this marriage strengthen Caesar's political position and legitimacy among Rome's elite? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hey everyone. Thanks for checking out another episode of our series, where Caesar met his wife. If you want to support our production of this series, please consider supporting us through the link in the description. Chapter 6, The Jugurthine War, Part 1, A Turning Point. The year is 110 BCE. It's me. Welcome to my channel, where we bring you the stories of ancient history's greatest battles. Today we discuss the start of the First Jugurtha War between Rome and the Kingdom of Numidia. In the previous episode, we saw how Jugurtha defied the Roman Senate and its attempts at extortion. And so, as the people of Rome prepared for another year of gladiatorial games and chariot races across the Mediterranean, war was being prepared. Our story begins in 116 BCE, when Gaius Marius, a man who would become one of the most famous Roman generals, set out for Africa. He was serving as a legate, that is, an officer subordinate to the proconsul under Quintus Caecilius Metellus Numidicus, whose task it was to subdue the troublesome king of Numidia. The trouble started after Rome had defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War. Metellus Numidicus, who had previously served as consul, was given command over this new province to restore order. But his brother, the elder Lucius Caecilius Metellus, who had been in charge of dividing up the spoils of war in the west, had annoyed King Jugurtha by refusing to award him territories that were promised by the Romans after the war. So Jugurtha declared war on Rome, and Metellus was sent to deal with him. Now when Metellus crossed into Numidia, he discovered what all of us old Africans know. You can't fight in the desert. There was no way he could conquer Numidia in a direct assault. So he decided to try something else. He went to the neighboring kingdoms of Massilia and Mauritania and concluded some treaties with them, which gave him some breathing room and, more importantly, allowed him to receive supplies. During these campaigns, Metellus earned the title Macer, which means blunt, referring to his slowness in battle. So with peace secured around him, Metellus returned to Rome to announce his victories and take a well-earned vacation, leaving Marius in charge of the army. This is where our story starts. As the two brothers prepared for their separate vacations, the Roman people were growing impatient with the stalemate in Numidia. There was a group of influential men called the Optimates, who wanted peace with Jugurtha. But there was another group called the Populares who thought that Rome should be more aggressive and demanded that Metellus be replaced with someone more competent, like Marius. With the backing of the Populares, Marius began to criticize the conduct of the war, declaring that it was going badly, because the general was spending too much time partying in Rome and not enough time fighting to. Now, this was crafty campaigning on Marius' part. While he had been a successful general before, he was actually quite unpopular in Rome, because he was from a minor branch of the gens Julia, and thus didn't have much political clout. By insulting Metellus, he was sticking it to the Optimates and endearing himself to the populares. But then something unexpected happened. The aging elder Metellus died suddenly, perhaps from malaria, which he picked up while campaigning in Africa. This created a power vacuum in the province of the HRE, and Marius was perfectly positioned to step into the breach and take command. If he could just get past the Senate. You see, even though the Optimates were staunch supporters of Metellus, they also knew that the war was stagnating and that Rome needed a new commander. But they wanted someone pliable, someone who would come in and keep the peace rather than continue the costly war. At the top of their list was Gnaeus Octavius, who was currently pro-praetor in Macedonia and was known for his conservative views. But Marius beat them to the punch. Once again, he launched a propaganda campaign, this time against Octavius, claiming that he was only interested in the consulship to line his own pockets, and that he would never truly support the war effort until he got what he wanted. He kept needling the Senate until they made him consul. So in 107 BCE, Gaius Marius became the first plebeian to hold the consulship, and he used this new authority to set out for Africa and claim the Jugurthine throne for Rome. When he arrived, he found a disaster waiting for him. You see, after Metellus left for Rome, Jugurtha attacked and nearly annihilated the Roman garrison at Cirta, forcing the survivors to flee into the hills. Marius now found himself in command of an army without a base of operations, supplies, or equipment. But he rallied his troops and got to work. He chose a site close to the sea for his headquarters, near the modern town of Annaba, because he understood the importance of naval supply lines. Then he set about fixing the logistical problems that plagued men. In fact, he ordered all pack animals captured during the war to be brought to him, so that he could use them to transport goods. But Jugurtha was not willing to let Marius resupply his troops in peace. He harassed the Romans day and night with hit-and-run attacks, and even raided their camp at night. On one occasion, he almost got away with killing Marius, who was saved by a centurion. Still, Marius knew he couldn't defeat Jugurtha unless he fixed his logistical problems. So he set up supply depots throughout Numidia and strengthened his fortifications. He also reformed the Roman siege equipment, which was outdated, and he introduced the use of catapults. All the while, he continued to repel Jugurtha's attacks, patiently waiting for his moment. Then, Egat Italiano. While Jugurtha was away on campaign, Marius took his fortress, putting an end to Jugurtha's war of attrition. Next, he set about raising the siege of the Roman garrison at Cirta, which had been held by Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, son of the aforementioned consular Metellus, who had been besieged for 3 years and was running low on food. The siege lasted for 5 months, and when it fell, the Romans found 30 elephants that the Numidians had captured earlier. Marius added these to his own war herd, which now numbered 80 elephants, and he used them to devastating effect throughout the war. Marius was now ready to hunt down Jugurtha and end the war once and for all. He led his army south, following the river toward Jugurtha's capital at Zama. But Jugurtha was too quick for him and reached Zama first. There he fortified the city walls and waited for Marius to come to him. After reaching Zama, Marius laid siege. But unlike the siege of Cirta, Jugurtha was able to supply his people and keep them in the fight. And so the siege dragged on for months. Finally, in the spring of 106 BCE, Marius managed to break into the city, but he soon realized that Jugurtha was not there. He had fled into the Numidian countryside, and so Marius pursued him, setting up camp along the river. But the Numidians were too quick for him and always managed to escape. One day, however, Jugurtha tried to ford the river with his elephant riders and was almost captured. From this point on, Marius was able to anticipate Jugurtha's moves and harass him at every turn. Finally, Jugurtha sent envoys to ask for a parley. When they met, Jugurtha offered to surrender himself if Marius agreed to spare his people. But Marius turned him down, saying that the Romans had already suffered too much for that. Instead, He proposed that Jugurtha surrender his kingdom in exchange for noble exile in Rome. Now, this was probably opportunistic on Marius' part, because he knew that the Senate would never allow Jugurtha to retain his kingdom, even if he had conquered it. But Jugurtha refused. He would rather die than surrender, and so Marius returned to his siege. We don't know exactly what happened next, but we do know that Jugurtha eventually surrendered. Perhaps he simply ran out of options. Maybe his people pressured him to end the bloodshed. Whatever the reason, when the news broke that Jugurtha had surrendered, the whole city erupted in cheers. When he paraded through the forum with his prisoner, Jugurtha looked haggard and broken, a far cry from the dashing young warrior he once was. The Romans, especially the Optimates, celebrated wildly, thinking that the worst was over. But Marius knew better. Jugurtha's lieutenants were still at large, and Rome had yet to collect any meaningful plunder. So as he prepared to march back to Rome to take his well-deserved victory lap, he left orders for his legate, Gaius Lucilius, to pursue Jugurtha's family and allies and bring them to justice. As the army marched out of Zama, word spread that Gaius Marius had betrayed Publius Sulpicius Rufus, the praetor whom Marius had displaced to take command in Africa, and had him murdered. But Marius wasn't finished. The war in Africa was over, but the war in Asia Minor was just beginning. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of Chapter 6. If you like this episode, please leave us a like and a comment telling us what you think. And if you haven't done so already, remember to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. See you next time. Chapter CAT Marius and military reforms that changed Rome. The late Republic was a time of civil wars, and much of the violence was caused by the armies being unable to demobilize after campaigns were over. Veteran soldiers without land to return to would either become a burden on their city or refuse to leave their camps and demand land. The resulting disorder led to civil war and factional violence within Rome. So how did Marius solve this problem? We'll find out today on this channel. I am your host, and this is the channel. Chapter 7 is on Marius and military reforms that changed Rome. When Gaius Marius became consul in 107 BC, he began his efforts to reform the Roman army. The first change he made was in recruitment. From the beginning of the Republic, only landowners could serve as officers, and only property-owning citizens could be enlisted as soldiers. This left a large pool of landless citizens without a way to make a living. But Marius realized that he could take advantage of this situation and created a professional standing army with soldiers who were free to fight for Rome without needing anything else from her. He instituted a system that allowed landless citizens to join the army with the stipulation that they would receive no pay while training and only enough pay to sustain themselves while campaigning. These men became known as capiti, sensi, or heads counted, because each soldier had to prove his worth to the state before he could be accepted into the ranks. This system wasn't all that different from other professional standing armies in the ancient Mediterranean, but it was new to Rome. And although this solved one problem, it created another. Now that Marius had a huge pool of soldiers to choose from, he needed some way to train and organize them. Unlike the Hellenistic armies, Roman soldiers were not professionals when they joined the ranks. They were just ordinary citizens that had been forced into service. Because of this, the manipular formation was used instead of the phalanx, which required soldiers to have years of experience before being able to join. Each cohort consisted of 4 maniples or divisions of about 120 men each. The first 2 were hostiti, or young soldiers who had never fought in battle before. The third was the principes, or senior soldiers who were between the ages of 30 and 40 and had extensive combat experience. Finally, there were the trieri, the veterans and most experienced soldiers that were typically around 50 years old and had served at least 8 years. These cohorts were organized into 3 lines with the hastati forming. The first line, the principes in the second, and the trieri in the third. While this organization worked well enough against Rome's enemies in Italy, it fell apart when facing the armies of the Pontic king. During the First Mithridatic War, Rome was fighting against an army that was just as numerous as their own. In fact, at one point, Rome was fighting against 80,000 Pontic infantry and 6,000 cavalry compared to their own 35,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. To make up for this disadvantage, Marius reorganized his army yet again. He grouped together the three maniple formations of each cohort into one unit, called a cohort, which contained both heavy infantry armed with spears and shields and light infantry armed with javelins and short swords. This reorganization meant that each cohort was only 480 men strong, but it also allowed for more flexibility in the battlefield. With this new system, 2 cohorts could be arranged back to form a rectangle and protect each other's flanks. Another benefit to this change was that if one cohort was wiped out, the other could continue to fight. These reforms were exactly what Rome needed, and its enemies were soon smashed. But the problems they caused would plague Rome for decades to come. Although Marius' reforms saved Rome in the short term, they caused major rifts between the patricians and the plebeians. When the Marian reforms were announced, the patricians opposed them vehemently, seeing them as a threat to the traditional Roman way of life. The bulk of the patrician class was made up of wealthy landowners who recruited the majority of Rome's soldiers. By taking landless people into the army, Marius was cutting away the patricians' power base. Marius didn't stop there, though, and went ahead to reorganize the entire system of military recruitment and advancement. Before his reforms, a soldier's rank was determined by wealth. Wealthy patricians could skip through the ranks much faster than poorer plebeians. But now the new system was based entirely on merit. Under the new system, even a poor plebeian could rise through the ranks and become a centurion, as long as he proved himself worthy. And many did just that. Some rose through the ranks so fast that they left their original cohort in a matter of months. Others earned their freedom from slavery or gained Roman citizenship for themselves and their children. To the dismay of the patricians, though, Marius didn't stop here. He also instituted promotions within the legion, allowing non-citizens to become officers as long as they proved their worth. At first, these people were only allowed to hold lower offices, but soon higher offices were also open to them. Eventually, there were freed slaves and non-citizens serving as military tribunes, and a freed slave named Lucius Cornelius Balcanius became a praetor. This caused outrage among the patricians who saw it as an affront to Roman customs. As far as the plebeians were concerned, though it was just another step towards full citizenship. For hundreds of years, the plebeians had been asking for representation in the government, but the patricians always refused until now. Seeing that the power of the army was shifting away from the patricians and towards the plebeians, the Senate finally gave in and created the office of tribune of the plebs to represent the common folk. This office was held by elected plebeians who were responsible for protecting the interests of their class. Although the reform seemed to benefit the plebeians and save Rome in the long run, they caused problems for Marius. In fact, they were part of the reason he was driven out of Rome in 100 BC, when he tried to secure a second consulship. The Senate refused, choosing instead to appoint Lucius Cornelius Sulla to the position. Outraged by this decision, Marius fled to the city of Pisa. From there, he raised an army and marched on Rome. His goal was to force the Senate to recognize his second consulship, and when he got to the city, he laid siege to it. After 90 days, though the siege was broken by Sulla, who was then appointed dictator, Marius' army fled the city and he himself fled to Africa. There he recruited another army and prepared for a counter. Unfortunately for him, he suffered a stroke and died soon after. Despite all the chaos he caused, the reforms Marius put in place lasted until the reign of Augustus, who reorganized the army again to make it look more like the armies of Greece. Besides reforming the army, Marius also waged war against the Germanic tribes north of the Alps and the Cimbri and Teutones in northern Italy. Both groups had been raiding Roman territory for years, but the Romans had been unable to stop them because of their superior equestrian skills. Marius faced the same problem, but adapted his tactics to account for it. Instead of trying to beat the barbarians at their own game, Marius took the fight to them. He chose locations for battles that were unfavorable to the horsemen and used a deep, compact formation to protect his troops. Then he unleashed his cavalry, destroying the barbarian horsemen before they could make an impact. This strategy won him victories against both the Cimbri and the Teutones, annihilating both armies and ending their raids once and for all. So although Marius lost his life trying to restore order to Rome, he accomplished his goal. After his death, Cinna and then Sulla took control of the city and implemented their own reforms, creating further division between the classes. The rivalry between the two factions continued throughout the Republic and culminated in Caesar's civil war. Even after Caesar's victory, the divisions remained, and it wasn't until Augustus came along that the Republic began to heal. Next time we'll look at the reign of Augustus and how he transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. If you want to get more from the series, make sure you check out our site where you can get early access to each chapter before it comes out here. You can also sign up to support this series directly and get access to exclusive content. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that thumbs up button below. It helps us grow and allows us to keep making content like this for you. Chapter 8. Victory over Jugurtha and growing fame Rome. 86 BC. The Senate has just received word that Jugurtha, the last king of Numidia, has met his end. Cheers erupt as senators congratulate one another, glad to finally see the back of such a dangerous enemy. But two men stand apart from the celebrations, one fuming with anger, the other, Gaius Marius, basking in reflected glory. You are listening to a history podcast. When Sulla marched into the Senate earlier that year to seize control of the government, one of his first acts was to strip Marius of the honors awarded him for his victories over the Cimbri, and Teutones denigrating him in the process. For his part, Marius had been campaigning in North Africa when this all went down, and he did unreturn to Rome until Jugurtha was already a dead man. Now he stands before the assembled throng and listens as Lucius Cornelius Lent, a senator, takes the floor and thanks the gods that at last the tyrant Jugurtha has been slain. Not only has he saved Italy, but he has also avenged the deaths of those killed in the social war. And who was responsible for this great victory? None other than the consul of 86 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius Magno. And while Lentulus is speaking, Marius looks over at Sulla, who sits stone-faced on the bench reserved for magistrates. He then turns back to face the crowd and throws his arms wide open, adopting the pose of a triumphant general. You could almost hear him roar, "Look upon me, the Romans, for I am your salvation." Lentulus finishes his speech, and the crowd erupts. They cheer for Pompey, but they also cheer for Marius. He has come to represent the common man against the machinations of the Roman elite. In short, he is the people's general. The crowd leaves the forum and makes their way to the Basilica Porta, where they storm the rostra and force the aediles to announce that Marius and his lieutenants, Lucius Mummius and Gaius Norbanus, should be granted a triumph. The next day, the Senate meets to discuss the matter, but Sulla cuts it short by reminding everyone that the king of Bithynia has not yet been defeated. True enough, but with Jugurtha gone, there is no serious opposition left. Sulla must be getting toward the end of his life. So, let us celebrate our good fortune while we may. But Sulla does not share in the joy. He hates Marius, and will not allow him to bask in the reflected glory of Jugurtha's defeat. He therefore vetoes the triumph, and the people are outraged. But Sulla is not finished with Marius. As Plutarch tells us, he still has one trick left. The great man has decided to go to Athens and put on a show there. And so when Marius returns to Rome, he finds the consulship lying empty and his name erased from the list of consuls. What is more? Quattro more. He learns that Sulla has had the record of his campaigns altered to make it look like he was the one who was slow to take action against the Carthaginians and allowed them to escape across the sea. In fact, according to Livy, Marius was given most of the credit for ending the Second Punic War. Now it is as if he never existed. But Rome is fickle, and her citizens quickly forget about Marius. It seems that Sulla has won, but in the end, he hasn't. And here's why. See, Marius was not the kind of guy to stay quiet in the face of injustice. Oh no. If anything, he was even less reserved than Caesar. In fact, many say that Marius was a better politician than Caesar. Here's what I mean. Remember how Caesar used to cozy up to Pompey and Crassus, and always seemed to be around whenever something important was going on? Well, Marius was not like that at all. It was a self-made man who climbed to the top all by himself. He was his own agent, so to speak. That was one reason why he was so popular with the common folk. And it was that popularity that he now used to full effect. He immediately began campaigning for a new consulship. His opponents called him New Minted, saying that he tried to appear fresh and untainted in order to win favor with the common folk. But in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, he won election and became consul again in 84 BC. He would hold the office 3 more times. This made him very popular, especially with the common folk. They admired him for standing up to the patricians and holding his ground. In short, he became the champion of the common man and the darling of the masses. Now, you might think that it is strange that Romans would prefer Marius to Sulla, since Sulla was the one who had restored the Republic after the social war. But you have to remember that it was Marius who was fighting alongside the populares against Sulla during the Civil War. To the common folk, he was their champion. Sulla was an aristocrat, someone who would always side with the rich. Marius was one of them. Sulla did realize what was happening, but he was already in Athens, where he spent his remaining years writing his memoirs. Still, he might have come back to Rome if he had felt it was necessary. He was still very much alive and kicking. In fact, Appian tells us that when he was about to cross the Hellespont, an old woman swam out to his ship and begged him to save her son, who had been sentenced to death for stealing one of Sulla's statues. "What kind of crime is it," she said, "to want to be like the gods?" Sulla agreed to spare the boy, but he threw the mother into prison and she died. Later, when news reached him that the Athenians were celebrating, he ordered her released and a wreath placed upon her head. So you can imagine how shocked and outraged the Romans must have been when they heard this story. Still, though, Sulla knew that he could not fight the tide. He was too old, and besides, he was busy with his memoirs. He would write 8 books of his own campaigns, which unfortunately have been lost. Then in 78 BC, he died in Athens, having accomplished what he set out to do: restore the Republic and leave his mark on Rome. Marius would die 4 years later, although we'll get to that in another episode. But for now, let us focus on the contrast between these two men. Both of them were generals. Both were born in the Italian countryside, and both were extremely successful. Yet they were complete opposites. Sulla was an aristocrat who made his way to the top. Marius was a commoner who clawed his way out of the mud. In the end, it was Marius who won the favor of the people, even though Sulla had done more for Rome. The masses hate the rich, and they love underdogs. And so Marius became the hero of the common folk, the champion of the poor, even though he wasn't really any of those things. He was simply a brilliant military commander who happened to be born into a lower social class. The people saw themselves in Marius, and they cheered him as their representative. Every time he entered the city, he rode on horseback without a helmet, even though he had lost part of his nose and one eye in battle. He was too proud to wear a horse-drawn carriage. Even though he had held the consulship a record 5 times, he always dressed plainly and drove a mule. He hated luxury and ostentation, and his frugality was legendary. Once he paid 200 sesterces for 2 figs, and insisted on weighing them on a gold scale. He also paid 500 sesterces for a crust of bread, because it was nicely toasted. And when he hosted a banquet for 7 men, he served 6 dishes of figs. He liked to humiliate rich people who ate too much, and he once chased a senator around his house with a whip. He was that kind of guy. He was a man of the people. Sulla, on the other hand, epitomized everything that the masses despised. He was born into an old and wealthy family. He loved luxuries, and he had little regard for the common folk. He was a typical patrician, cold, calculating, and ruthless. Marius was everything that Sulla was not. He was brash and impulsive. He was not afraid of getting his hands dirty, and he was always willing to help the poor. He was also charismatic and handsome. He had red hair and piercing blue eyes. People loved him, and they would follow him anywhere. In the end, it was not military prowess, but rather personality that made Marius famous. Let me explain. If we measure fame by the number of statues and monuments erected in one's honor, then Sulla easily wins. There are at least 100 known statues of Sulla, while there are only 35 known statues of Marius. On the flip side, if we judge by coins minted during each man's lifetime, then Marius comes out ahead. During his career, 117 coins were minted in his honor. Only 28 coins were minted during Sulla's career. So which man was more famous? By some measures, it was definitely Sulla. But in the minds of the people, it was Marius. And that's why we remember him today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 9, the Cimbrian and Teutonic Threat. As we ended things last time, Rome was in big trouble. The migrating Germanic tribes were bearing down on the Italian peninsula, like a runaway Galavidian bull. And so Rome's leaders did what they always did when faced with an impossible situation. They turned to Marius for help. But the problem this time was, he was dead. You know, executed by the tribunes of the plebs after that whole Catiline conspiracy fiasco. So if you're Rome, what do you do when your most successful general of all time is dead? Simple. You dig up his corpse and make him consul again. Now wait, before you ask how they got away with that. Or worse, why hasn't someone just killed him already? Just roll with it. It's not the craziest thing that happened during the late Republic. So in 104 BCE, 7 years after his first consulship, and 3 years after his death, Marius was brought back from the grave to handle Rome's new Germanic problem. A little later, in 102, he was made consul again. Then again in 101, and finally in 100 BC, which is a record 5 elections held during his lifetime. During those 3 years without Rome being defeated in battle, Marius would reform the Roman army from top to bottom, creating the hardened killing machine needed to take on the likes of the Cimbri and Teutones. Now, as we mentioned last time, Rome had actually met the Cimbri and Teutones before. It was at the Battle of Arrasio in 105 BC, where a Roman force of about 80,000 men under the consuls Lucius Caesar and Gnaeus Papirius Carbo got absolutely creamed by an alliance of Gauls and Germans. And here's where our story picks up. We find Gaius Marius, recently returned from exile, watching the funeral games in the Roman Forum for the men lost at Arrasio. Like most Romans, he's angry. Like most politicians, he wants to be in charge of doing something about it. This was not easy, though. See, the Germanic tribes weren't just outside the gates of Rome begging to get in and throw the city into permanent chaos. They were deep in Cisalpine Gaul, razing towns and villages, and generally causing trouble, but still far enough away that Rome could breathe easy, for now. The situation was similar to that of Hannibal in the Second Punic War, where Rome wasn't under direct threat, but everyone knew that sooner or later the barbarians would come for them. In this case, it was pretty clear they already were. And so Marius's job was complicated. He couldn't just go to war against the Cimbri and Teutones and leave Rome undefended. And he couldn't just stay in Rome either. That would be giving in to the barbarians. For Marius, this meant finding a middle ground, raising an army large enough to stop the Teutones from marching on Rome, but not so large that it endangered the city. This wasn't easy, especially considering Rome had less than 20,000 men under arms at the time. Eventually, though, he got permission to raise 2 new legions and set about putting together his army. But these were no ordinary legions. Marius took every opportunity he could to bring the Roman army out of the archaic Renaissance era of the late Republic and into the modern age. As they saw it, Rome was fighting a war unlike any other before it. The enemy was different, their tactics were different, even their way of thinking was different, and so Rome needed new methods to beat them. First, let's look at the equipment of his soldiers. Up until now, Roman infantry carried a sword, a dagger, a shield, a helmet, and whatever other odds and ends they could afford. But Marius found this insufficient, and so he standardized and hardened the equipment of his troops, starting with their weapons. The old-style gladius, or short sword, was good for thrusting and slashing in tight quarters, but useless for long-distance engagements. So Marius introduced a new longer sword that could be used for thrusting and slashing at a distance, more akin to a rapier than a dagger. The hilts of these swords were also made larger to better support the shield, and shields themselves were enlarged and reinforced with leathers, thongs, and metal bosses. Meanwhile, helmets were improved with additional metal plating and cheek guards, making them harder to knock off and easier to fight in. To better accommodate these changes, armor was also updated. Previously, Roman soldiers wore metal armor only on their upper body, with linen or leather covering the lower half. But now the sheaths and greaves were standard issue for all foot soldiers. The next thing Marius did was introduce a new formation for his troops known as the maniple. This was designed to be flexible, allowing units to change their formations depending on the situation. For example, a maniple could be deployed in a tight column for effective shock troop assaults, or they could be spread out in a wide line formation for defensive purposes, or anything in between. The key feature of the maniple was its modularity, which allowed greater flexibility in the way the army was deployed on the battlefield. Finally, there was training. Every soldier going into the field was expected to be able to function on their own and carry out orders from their officers without hesitation. This was true of every army of this period. But Marius took it a step further. Not only did he want his troops to be able to think for themselves, he wanted them to be able to think strategically. And so the general spent countless hours on the training grounds, showing his men how to adapt to changing situations and teaching them how to respond to the different tactics of their enemies. In the end, Marius had built himself a super soldier, a template for the type of disciplined, highly trained professional soldiers Rome would rely on for centuries to come. With his army ready, Marius marched north to meet the Teutones head-on. But that'll have to wait for next time. If you want to see how Marius's newfangled army stood up against the might of the Teutones, then stay tuned. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video. It helps us a lot. Thank you. Also, check out our new account at a website. You can help support us directly through donations. There's a link on screen. Thank you so much for watching. This is the History Guy, with a special episode about Julius Caesar and the Roman Republic. This is Chapter 10, Crushing the Cimbri and Teutones. Our story begins in the summer of 102 BCE. The Roman legions were once again facing off against the Cimbri and Teutones. Last year, Gaius Marius had beaten them at the Battle of Aquisec. And if you're new here, we've actually done an episode about that battle before. You can find it right up here. In fact, just to remind you how crazy that battle was, let me read you this passage from Plutarch's Life of Marius. It says, "The fight now grew so fierce that there was no possibility of either side giving way or yielding. The enemy fought on every side alike, not only in the open field where our men were, but also in the marshes, on the hills and everywhere. Some tried to turn our flank, some attacked our rear. Our men fought desperately with those who attacked them in the open, and they stood firm against those who charged up the hills. Spears were hurled, swords clashed, cavalry clashed. There was nothing to stop the bloodshed. Men fell on both sides, though most of them were slain in the marsh. But despite all their fierceness, the Gauls couldn't withstand the disciplined Roman attack led by Gaius Marius. As the historian Arpinum put it, Marius, being the first general who made use of the discipline of his soldiers for attack as well as defense, gave orders for the legions to form 4 deep ranks. Each one advancing as the one before, it gave way and continued the attack without confusion. But even though they lost more than 120 elephants and over 40,000 warriors, the Cimbri and Teutones refused to retreat. They stayed in the field for 3 days until they had eaten all of their supplies. When their food ran out, they left and went back to their lands, licking their wounds and waiting for another day. So when Marius learned that they had retreated back into northern Italy, he followed after them, determined to crush them once and for all. In the spring of 101 BCE, Marius and his army marched north to a place called Vercellae, near the modern town of Vercellae in northern Italy. Here he faced an army of over 60,000 Gauls, many of whom were still angry over what happened at Aquisec. But this time Marius was prepared. First, he chose a perfect location for his camp, selecting a high-level spot near a river that was protected by marshland. Then he divided his forces into 5 detachments, under the command of 5 experienced generals. Finally, he held a council of war and shared his battle plan with his officers. In essence, his strategy was pretty simple. The Gauls were much more numerous than the Romans, so instead of trying to defeat them head-on, Marius planned to bait them into attacking him. He then would lure them away from their camp, wear them down, and finally crush them with the full force of his legions. So after completing his preparations, he gave the order to begin the show. The Roman detachment on the far left of the line pretended to waver and retreat, which lured a large number of Gauls away from their camp. At the same time, the rest of the Roman army maintained a strong defensive posture, ready to repulse any attack. And as expected, the Gauls jumped at the chance to destroy the retreating Romans, but they fell right into Marius's trap. As the Gauls surged forward, the Roman center held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties while slowly giving way. This caused the Gauls to become overextended on their left wing, allowing the Roman detachment that had been hiding in the marshlands to slip behind them and cut off their retreat. With their escape route cut off, the Gauls on the left wing found themselves trapped and vulnerable. And that's when Marius unleashed the second part of his plan. The Roman center, pretending to be exhausted, suddenly counterattacked, driving the remaining Gauls back towards their own camp. With the Gauls now caught between two powerful Roman forces, their fate was sealed. Marius ordered the entire Roman army to advance, and the Gauls broke and fled in all directions. The Romans pursued them relentlessly, inflicting massive casualties, until the entire army of the Cimbri and Teutones was utterly destroyed. The survivors fled back to their camps, where they committed mass suicide rather than surrender to the mercy of the Romans. When news of these victories reached Rome, the people went wild. They celebrated for 25 days and 25 nights, honoring Marius as the third founder of Rome. You see, Rome was founded traditionally in 753 BCE, and since then, there had been two other times when Rome had been saved from destruction. The first was in 494 BCE, when the plebeians threatened to leave the city unless their demands for political representation were met. The second was in 366 BCE, when the patricians lifted the 366-day siege imposed on the plebeians during the secession of the plebis. Marius defeated the Cimbri and Teutones was seen as the third time Rome had been saved, hence the third founder. As a result of these celebrations, statues were erected in his honor throughout the city and along the road from the capital to the battlefield, and the people even dedicated a triumph to him. Although triumphs were usually reserved for emperors, not generals. Furthermore, because of these victories, Marius was elected consul for a second time, which was virtually unheard of in ancient Rome. It was only done twice in the entire history of the Republic before, and both times it was because of civil war. But in Marius's case, it was because of a foreign war. And that wasn't all. The tribunes of the plebs proposed that Marius should be appointed dictator, the highest office in ancient Rome, which granted him absolute power. And believe me, this was no honor for Marius, because he absolutely hated the idea of dictatorship. In fact, he said to Caesar that he would rather lose all his property than spend one night as a dictator. Nevertheless, he accepted the honor, although it only lasted a few months, and he used his power to institute reforms in the military, such as granting land to his veterans. But the real prize was the consulship, because it gave Marius control of Rome's finances, and that allowed him to maintain a standing army, something that had never been done before. You see, in normal times, the Roman legions were demobilized after a campaign and sent back to their farms. However, Marius kept his army intact and paid them to stay in service, and that created all sorts of problems. To learn more about them, join me next time for Chapter 11, The Marian Reforms. In the meantime, if you want to check out some of our other videos, just click right here. Remember to subscribe and come back soon. Thank you for watching. Stay awesome, and I'll see you next time. Chapter 11. The political turmoil of his later years. Gaius Marius had triumphed in his war against the Cimbri and Teutones, and was acclaimed by the grateful citizens of Rome. But during the victory celebrations, he noticed that not everyone was happy for him. A group of senators looked on sourly from the top of the podium. You would come to find out that their displeasure at his victory stemmed from a fear that he might now use his success to take power away from them in their class. This feeling would only grow stronger after Gaius made an alliance with the most dangerous man in Rome, the populist tribune. The political climate in Rome is best described as unstable. There was a definite split between the elites who had all the power and the people who had none, and both sides were willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. After his return from the war, Gaius needed to secure his position in Rome, so he sought an alliance with one of the leading contenders for consul, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Unfortunately, while Sulla was initially open to working with Marius, he would later go back on his word after being pressured by his wife. That left Gaius without an ally inside the Senate, and he desperately needed to find a new one. At this point, he turned to the tribunes of the plebs, or the plebeian council, for help. This group held immense power in Rome, as they could pass legislation that directly contradicted the Senate's wishes. They were elected by the common folk, and thus represented their interests. And no one better embodied those interests than Senate. The two men joined forces, and began passing laws that favored the common citizen. Some of these laws were positive and would help Rome in the long run, like the Lex Cornelia de Sicaria, which helped criminals escape the death penalty. However, Others would hurt Rome greatly, like the lex Reshaped, which allowed any Roman male to become a soldier without needing to be recruited. These laws made him extremely popular with the general population, but they also made him extremely unpopular with the Senate and the patrician class. Tensions rose until it culminated in violence when a group of armed patricians attacked and killed Saturninus' supporters. In response, Saturninus had the Senate put down and prescribed a list of senators who opposed him. These measures did not go over well with Gaius, even though he benefited from them. It created a huge rift between him and the Senate, and he knew that he would need allies to survive politically. This led him to seek the support of the Populares, a political party dedicated to helping the common citizen. They were gaining popularity in Rome, but they weren't powerful enough to make real change. Their leader, Gaius Gracchus, understood this, and in order to push their agenda forward, he planned to use force, but he would need more men than his party could muster. So he appealed to Gaius Marius for troops. Although Marius supplied the soldiers, he still commanded them, keeping them loyal to him instead of the Populares. The violence continued as Gaius made moves to become consul for the next year. This meant that he and Sulla would be consuls together. It was an unprecedented move in Roman politics and was seen as a threat by many. As tensions flared up, so did the fighting in the streets. More bloodshed occurred between the supporters and opponents of Gaius. And even though he won the consulship, it was clear that the violence wasn't over. His appointment as consul for the next year didn't calm anyone down. It only made things worse. To make matters worse, Gaius lost his adopted son and heir, Gaius Marius the Younger, who died in one of the street battles. But this tragedy would only fuel Gaius' desire for vengeance. Sulla used this sentiment to his advantage and moved against Marius, forcing him to flee Rome. But this wasn't the end of Marius' story. He gathered allies and supporters and marched on Rome, kicking off a civil war. In order to defeat Marius, Sulla had to leave Rome and fight him in his own territory. When Sulla finally returned to Rome, he proscribed Marius and his son Cimbri, confiscated their property and exiled many of his supporters. He then left to finish the war in the east, and in his absence, Rome erupted into chaos once again. The people of Rome hated what Sulla did to Marius, and they were looking for someone to lead them against him. Enter Cinna, a supporter of Marius, who had been in exile since Sulla's takeover. The people of Rome loved him, and they begged him to return and save them from Sulla. Upon hearing this, Cinna sailed back to Rome with a fleet of ships and took over the city. He executed the pro-Sulla party and proscribed their families. Then he left to meet up with Marius, who was planning to invade Italy. Upon their reunion, Cinna appointed Marius as consul and gave the command of the Roman army to himself. Together, they planned to march on Rome and defeat Sulla. Unfortunately, Cinna would die before they could execute the plan. It fell to Marius to finish what they started. With Cinna dead, Marius marched on Rome and defeated Sulla's forces. He then entered Rome triumphantly and began his revenge. He proscribed every senator and equestrian that supported Sulla, confiscating their property and distributing it to his supporters. This left Sulla with no choice but to flee the city. Once-empowered Marius continued to stack the deck in his favor. He appointed his sons-in-law to influential positions and had them hand out contracts to his supporters. This cemented their loyalty to him and gave them something to lose if they went against him. But the cruelty he showed his enemies would tarnish his legacy forever. He proscribed around 90 of the Roman senators, eliminating any opposition he might have in the future. But that future was much closer than he thought. When Sulla returned to Rome with reinforcements, Marius and his sons-in-law fled to the north and raised an army to stop him. When the two armies met, they engaged in battle, but the strength of Sulla's army was too much for Marius. He lost the battle and retreated to the city of Rome. It was here that he learned the worst news possible. Rome had fallen to Sulla, and his sons-in-law were being hunted down. All hope seemed to be lost, but a messenger arrived from the north with an offer. The Cimbri and Teutones were declaring war on Rome again, and wanted Marius to come back and lead them against them. This gave Marius the perfect excuse to get out of town and get another chance at defeating Sulla. He accepted the offer and left for the north. When he arrived, he saw that the army wasn't as strong as he remembered it. Many of the old soldiers had retired and needed to be replaced. This meant that he would have to start from scratch. But he was confident that he could win another victory against the Germanic tribes. But the road to victory was a long one, so he decided to take a detour through the Apennine Mountains. This would shorten the travel time by weeks, but it was very dangerous. While crossing the mountains, his army was ambushed by the Cimbri. Although the Romans fought hard, they couldn't defeat the Germanic warriors. In the end, Marius and most of his army were slain. With the death of Marius, the hopes of defeating Sulla died along with him. Sulla would go on to conquer northern Italy and march on Rome, ending the civil war once and for all. Now that we've covered the events of his life, it's time to answer the question: what was the darkest part of Marius's story? Obviously, there are several possibilities. You could say it was his relentless pursuit of power, which ultimately led to his downfall. Or perhaps it was his violent alliance with Saturninus, which plunged Rome into chaos. Maybe it was his proscription of so many senators, which destabilized the Roman state. Or maybe it was his brutality against his enemies, which tarnished his legacy. But in reality, the darkest part of Marius' story is a combination of all these factors. It was his relentless pursuit of power, combined with his violent tendencies and his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. It was this combination of traits that made him the most successful general of his time, but it was also what ultimately led to his downfall. I want to hear your thoughts on this. What was the darkest part of Marius' story? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider supporting me on a crowdfunding platform. Thank you for watching. Chapter 12. Rivalry with Sulla and the March on Rome. The year is 88 BCE, and Gaius Marius is furious. The Senate has given command of the First Mithridatic War to the handsome young patrician Lucius Cornelius Sulla, bypassing Marius, who had experienced victories over the other side in the war already under his belt. But that was old news. This was now a political issue, and when the Senate backed down and gave him command, Marius showed them what he was capable of. He raised an army and marched on Rome, the first person ever to do so. And when he got there, he showed Sulla just how much power he really had. This was a game changer and would serve as a model for future ambitious generals. This is chapter 12 of our series on the history of Rome. We've done episodes on the social war and the First Mithridatic War before, and we talked about Marius' role in those conflicts. You can check out those episodes if you need to refresh your memory, but long story short, Marius was a brilliant general who had won victories against the Germanic tribes in the north and against Mithridates the Great in the east. Now he was frustrated because after all his efforts, the Senate hadn't given him any credit or glory. They had instead showered praise and honors on young Sulla, a popular politician who was riding high off his successful war in the First Mithridatic War. This wasn't the only bone of contention between them. Both men were rivals of Gaius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who had used his influence and power to increase his own authority and that of his family. And both men wanted to take him down. But Marius and Sulla were fundamentally different in their backgrounds and outlook. Marius was a new kind of general, a professional soldier who came from humble beginnings and rose through the ranks. He was a Marian type, someone who could fight in the front lines, leading by example, but also think strategically like a general should. Sulla, on the other hand, was a politician, first and foremost. He believed in strategy and tactics, but he preferred to lead from the rear. His specialty was logistics and administration. As it turned out, this rivalry would become one of the most famous in Roman history, a battle of two titans. But for now, it was Marius who would make the first move. In 88 BCE, while Sulla was celebrating his triumph for winning the First Mithridatic War, Marius flew into a rage when he heard that the Senate had appointed Sulla to command the Second Mithridatic War, which was already in full swing. To make matters worse, he felt that the Senate was humiliating him by giving him a subordinate role under Sulla. So he did something that no Roman general had ever done before. He took his 2 legions and marched on Rome. We don't know exactly why he chose this course of action, but it probably had a lot to do with his pride and ambition. He might have thought that he could easily defeat Sulla and seize control of the war for himself. Or maybe he wanted to punish the Senate for not giving him the recognition he deserved. Whatever his reasons, Marius' march on Rome would change the city and the Republic forever. He traveled south from his headquarters in northern Italy towards the capital. Along the way, he picked up more troops and supplies, and made it clear that he was willing to go to any lengths to get what he wanted. By the time he reached Rome, he had built up a force of 10,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. It was a smaller force than Sulla would field later, but it was still formidable. The citizens of Rome were shocked. Never before had a Roman general dared to attack the city. Even during the civil wars of the late Republic, generals stayed away from Rome. The city was sacred ground, and any general who attacked it was considered a traitor. But Marius didn't care about any of that. He wanted the Senate and Sulla to fear him, and he knew that he could get their attention by threatening Rome itself. He camped outside the city and began to lay siege. At first, things went well for him. He positioned his troops so that they could cut off supplies to the city, and then he sent a letter to the Senate demanding that they give him command of the war. But the Senate refused. They were shocked by Marius's audacity, and they weren't going to give in to his demands. Marius responded by tightening the siege. He cut off all water to the city and began to attack the walls. The citizens of Rome suffered greatly, but they were able to hold out until Sulla arrived. When the two armies met outside the city, it was clear that Marius had the advantage. He had more troops, and he was more experienced. But Sulla was smarter. He knew that he couldn't win a battle against Marius, so he pretended to flee. This lured Marius into a trap. As soon as he gave the order to pursue, Sulla's cavalry turned around and attacked the Marian infantry. It was a devastating blow, and it practically ended the conflict right there. Many of Marius's troops were killed, and the rest fled to the hills outside the city. Sulla entered Rome as a hero, and Marius was forced to escape to Africa. It was a stunning victory for Sulla, and it made him the most powerful man in Rome. But it also set a dangerous precedent. From now on, any general who had enough power could march on Rome and seize control of the government. It was a threat that would hang over the city for the next century, and it would eventually lead to the fall of the Republic. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Marius's supporters were brutally crushed. Many were put to death, including Marius's son, and others were exiled from the city. Sulla prescribed, meaning he placed a price on their heads and encouraged anyone to kill them and collect the reward. But Marius himself was able to escape to Africa, where he lived in exile for the rest of his life. He died in 80 BCE at the age of 60. Sulla's victory was complete, but it was short-lived. After defeating Marius, he went to the east to finish the war with Mithra, and there he faced the new threat, the rising power of the Pontic king. We'll talk about that in a future episode. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the city was in ruins. The war had devastated the economy and left thousands of people dead, but Sulla didn't care. He had won the war, and that was all that mattered. He began to rebuild the city, but he did it in a way that would make him even more powerful. He built new roads and aqueducts, but he also built new temples and shrines to himself. He was a dictator now, and he wanted everyone to know it. He also made sure to reward his supporters and punish his enemies. He gave land and money to veterans of his army, and he made sure that Marius's supporters were kept out of the government. He was ruthless and efficient, and he ruled Rome with an iron fist. But it didn't last. After 8 years, he went to Greece for one last campaign against Mithra, and he died there in 78 BCE, at the age of 58. When he died, the government passed to his designated heir, the former consul Lucius Valerius. He was a weak leader, and the Senate was eager to get rid of him, so they found a way to pass the government to a former enemy of Silanus, Pompeius Magnus. You may have heard of him. He was the great General Pompey. After suppressing the revolt in Asia, Sulla returned to Rome and was greeted as a hero. He had defeated Marius and ended the threat of war in the east. But he was also a controversial figure. He had marched on Rome and seized control of the government, and many people, especially in the Senate, hated him for it. But Sulla didn't care. He was a dictator now, and he was going to do things his way. He began to reform the Roman army. He introduced new weapons and armor, and he made sure that the soldiers were better trained. He also began to build up the navy. For the first time in Roman history, he created a standing navy that was always ready to go to war. He also began to expand Rome's territory. He conquered the island of Cyprus and the province of Asia Minor. He also fought a war against the Dardani in the Balkans, and he defeated them decisively. But it wasn't all easy. He faced opposition from Rome and from the other generals who were jealous of his power, but Sulla was too strong for them. He defeated them all and emerged as the most powerful Roman general. but it was short-lived. After defeating Marius, he went to the east to finish the war with Mithra, and there he faced a new threat, the rising power of the Pontic king. We'll talk about that in a future episode. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the city was in ruins. The war had devastated the economy and left thousands of people dead. But Sulla didn't care. He had won the war, and that was all that mattered. He began to rebuild the city, but he did it in a way that would make him even more powerful. He built new roads and aqueducts, but he also built new temples and shrines to himself. He was a dictator now, and he wanted everyone to know it. He also made sure to reward his supporters and punish his enemies. He gave land and money to veterans of his army, and he made sure that Marius's supporters were kept out of the government. He was ruthless and efficient, and he ruled Rome with an iron fist, but it didn't last. After 8 years, he went to Greece for one last campaign against Mithra, and he died there in 78 BCE at the age of 58. When he did, the government passed to his designated heir, the former consul, Lucius Valerius. He was a weak leader and the Senate was eager to get rid of him, so they found a way to pass the government to a former enemy of Sulla, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. You may have heard of him. He was the great General Pompey, and now you know how he got that job. If you enjoyed this episode, check out Chapter 11, where we covered Sulla's rise to power and his early campaigns against the Marians. And we'll see you next time for Chapter 13, where we'll cover the Third Macedonian War and the rise of Pompey the Great. Chapter 13. Exile, Return, and Final Consulship. Marius was a Roman general who held an unprecedented 7 consulships, fought numerous successful military campaigns, and helped shape the future of Rome. But he might be best remembered for his death, which if you've seen the Spartacus TV series is probably the most brutal scene in that show. Well, let's take a look at what happened to Marius after his 6th consulship and how he died. This is Chapter 13 of our series covering the entire life of Marius. Be sure to check out the playlist for links to all the previous episodes. So, back to the story. Marius was enjoying his 5th consulship when he got some bad news. The Pontic king Mithridates the 6th had invaded the Roman province of Asia and was giving the Roman legions there a hard time. Of course, it wasn't long before the Roman Senate declared war on him, and because he was already popular with the common folk back in Rome, the Senate didn't bother trying to convince Marius to stay out of this conflict. Instead, they just went ahead and appointed him as the chief commander of the Roman forces sent to deal with this so-called Mithridatic War. But before we get into how Marius fared against this new enemy, if you're enjoying this series and want more content like this, please consider supporting us. The year is 89 BC. And Marius has just arrived in Greece with his army. From there, he began his campaign by marching north to the province of Thrace, where General Archelaus had taken a large force of Pontic troops. These two armies met up at the river Ipsus, and the ensuing battle was one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. But in the end, the Romans prevailed and Archelaus was forced to flee. After regrouping, though, the Pontic general got his revenge, defeating another Roman force led by the consul Gnaeus Octavius at the Battle of Chalcis. Enraged by this embarrassing defeat, the Roman Senate decided to replace the ineffective Octavius with Marius, naming him sole consul for the 2nd time. Unfortunately, though, Marius had left Italy with little more than 7,000 troops, and when he got to Greece, he found that most of the Roman allies in the east had switched over to the Pontic side. So upon arriving in Athens, he sent back to Rome for reinforcements. But in the meantime, he had to make do with the small force he had and hold on to Athens while also watching the rest of Greece fall to the Pontics. With only 12 cohorts, or roughly 5,400 men, he defended the city and its harbor Piraeus from 3 sieges, each time turning away Pontic forces nearly twice as large as his own. In fact, during one of these attacks, a Roman officer named Lucius Cornelius Sulla came down with a fever and delirious, made his way to Marius' tent. He told his general that he had a vision showing him becoming dictator of Rome with Marius as his lieutenant, and then he expired in front of him. It was obviously a strange occurrence, but still, seeing as Rome was having trouble in other parts of the Mediterranean, especially against the new threat of the Jewish queen, Cleopatra, Marius appreciated that Sulla was coming with 4,000 men to relieve him. Still, even with Sulla's help, He was unable to take the offensive, choosing instead to bide his time until reinforcements arrived. Eventually, reinforcements did come, and with them, the Primarian faction in Rome gave Gaius Marius the unusual honor of holding 2 consulships at once. Consulship of the year 88 BC. But of course, this caused the anti-Marian faction, led by the Metelli, to object. They refused to recognize Marius' authority, declaring that he had abandoned his post and left Italy undefended. What happened next was that the 2 consuls raced to arrive in Rome first, and since Marius was closer, he won, taking the consulship for himself and sending Sulla to the east to continue fighting King Myth. But as soon as Marius had settled into his new term, he ran into trouble. Not long after he assumed his new consulship, he learned that Rome was being attacked by the Germanic tribes known as the Cimbri and Teutones, and everyone agreed that he needed to go defend Rome immediately. And so once again, Marius left his post. However, this time he left without appointing anyone else to replace him. So his political rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, decided to take matters into his own hands and seize power for himself, leaving Rome for the east to grab command of the Roman armies there. Upon learning of Sulla's actions, Marius was furious and demanded that he be recalled to Rome to face charges of conspiracy. But Sulla refused, stating that he was busy campaigning in the east. Realizing that he couldn't fight Sulla and the army he commanded, Marius set his sights on getting the Senate to pass a law that would declare Sulla's actions illegal and transfer command of the eastern armies to himself. But just as he was about to pull this off, Sulla marched on Rome with his army and took control of the city. With Marius gone, the Senate saw this as their chance to get rid of him for good. They passed the Vindex law, which basically barred him from holding any public office ever again. And then they sent troops to kill him, which forced Marius to flee for his life. For months, Marius lived in hiding, staying mostly in the house of his friend, the philosopher Epicurus, and in particular, the Optimates, or the traditionalist senators, hated him. Many of them had fled Rome during the civil wars between the populares, of which Marius was a leading member, and But now that things seemed to be stabilizing under Marius' rule, they began to return to the city. But as soon as they stepped foot in Rome, they were put to death. The details are shockingly graphic, but basically thousands of Optimates were murdered by the followers of Marius and Cinna. Friends and family of Marius, including his wife Julia, were given lists of names of their enemies, and then were allowed to kill them and take their property. In fact, people weren't even safe in the Senate itself, and as soon as it was full, the Marian mob moved on to the Temple of Bologna, where they slew even more people. For 4 days, the streets of Rome ran red with blood, and estimates of those killed vary wildly, anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000, perhaps even more. In the end, this led to Marius being appointed to a 4th consulship in 86 BCE, with Cinna as his colleague, but he was not well. A short time later, he suffered a debilitating stroke that paralyzed his entire right side. But despite this, he insisted on keeping his post and exercising his authority. But before we get into how he died, if you're enjoying this series and want more content like this, please consider supporting us. So, Marius served as consul throughout 86 BC. Despite his failing health, which was possibly a result of mercury poisoning. You see, in ancient Rome, physicians believed that illnesses could be treated by rubbing various medicinal herbs and chemicals onto the skin, which was then absorbed into the bloodstream. And in Marius' case, it seems that they used too much mercury in his treatments. Whatever the cause, by the end of the year, he was completely blind and unable to speak. And so he was carried to the forum of Julius Caesar by his freedmen to watch the gladiatorial games being held there. While watching, he reportedly fell out of his chair and expired in front of everyone. So that is how Gaius Marius died, one of the most important generals in Roman history, but whose memory has been tarnished by his involvement in the bloody purge of 88 BCE. What do you think? Was he a champion of the poor and a brilliant general, or a power-hungry despot who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals? Let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out the playlist for links to all the previous episodes. Special thanks to our supporters who make videos like this possible. If you want to see your name at the end of episodes, then you too can support us. The link to that is in the description. Anyway, thanks for watching. Chapter 14. Death a week after Marius took up his 7th consulship. He was dead. It was 86 BC, and Rome was in crisis. Civil war raged across the Italian peninsula, and now their leader, the great General Gaius Marius, was dead. Or how did this happen? How did Marius die only days into his 7th consulship? And what was so significant about that? Why do we even care? Was it really so bad if one old guy died? Well, yes, actually, it was. For reasons we'll explore right now on this channel. When news of Marius's death reached Rome, people had 3 immediate reactions. They were afraid, they were relieved, and they were in awe. Let's start with fear, because that's pretty easy to understand. If anyone could bring Rome to its knees, it was Marius. Even in his 70s, he was the greatest general Rome had ever seen. He had defeated the Cimbri and the Teutones, and he had reformed Rome's military from a volunteer militia force into a standing army. That wasn't exactly subtle or popular at the time, but the results were undeniable. And besides all that, he was still the most popular Roman politician around. So who would take his place? Who would lead Rome now? Would civil war consume them all? People were afraid, but also relieved, because honestly, there was a lot of opposition to Marius these days. He was a polarizing figure, both within the political elite and amongst the Roman populace. Many thought he was a dangerous tyrant who would trample the Republic underfoot. Many others respected him for his achievements, his military victories, and his social reforms made him a hero of the common people. And the common people were the base of his power. But Marius was aware that his position was precarious. That's why he chose Cinna, his ally and close friend, as his heir apparent. Marius had adopted Cinna, taking him into his own household and legally making him his son. In doing so, Marius made Cinna a member of the Marian gens, which made Cinna eligible to become consul. And that's exactly what happened. While Marius was busy subduing revolts in Africa, Cinna became consul for 84 BC. But when Marius came back to Rome in 84, he wanted to be consul again himself. The two argued over it, and it looked like Marius had won, at least for now. But that doesn't mean Marius was safe, for his enemies now controlled the government, and they weren't going to let Marius get away with this. He had too much blood on his hands, too many enemies. Now, those enemies included not just fellow politicians, but also Marius's former allies and subordinates. When news of Marius's death reached Sulla, he was in Asia Minor, and he didn't know what to think. On the one hand, Marius was his rival and a thorn in his side for nearly 2 decades. On the other hand, they were once friends and allies. They had fought together against the Italians and the Gauls. And besides all that, Marius was older than Sulla and near the end of his life. Did Sulla feel anything when he heard about Marius's death? Maybe, but he was careful not to show it. Instead, he mourned another general, Gaius Flavius Fimbria, who died in that same revolt in Africa that brought Marius back to Rome. Fimbria was another brilliant general, who might have been his greatest military mind if not for Marius and Sulla. Fimbria was killed by sword while fighting in Numidia, but the swords that slew him were wielded by the very people who Marius and Fimbria had helped raise to power. King Jugurtha of Numidia hired some freed slaves from Rome, armed them with swords, and had them storm Fimbria's camp. According to Plutarch, the swords were so sharp and so numerous that no shield or armor could hold them off. Fimbria was killed trying to protect his baggage train. Sulla loved that story, and when he heard about Fimbria's death, he took out an augur's book and wrote a prophecy about it. This is what it said: "Thus ends a great man's life, not by fortune of arms or treachery, but by the negligence of those who are his own." It was a thinly veiled warning to the men who put him in charge of Marius's unfinished business. Don't think I didn't notice what happened to Fimbria. Sulla, just like everyone else in Rome, was afraid. But he knew that fear wouldn't help him. The best thing he could do was to secure his position in Rome and set his sights on Marius's adopted son, Cinna. The first order of business was to get his brother back from exile. Lucius Cornelius Sulla had gone into self-imposed exile in 91, after he and Marius clashed over land reform. Sulla was a supporter of the Optimates, the political elite who dominated Roman politics for centuries. The 88 Lucius was living in the city of Athens and running a casino. But now Sulla called him back to Rome to serve as his lieutenant in the coming conflict. Once Lucius arrived in Rome, he started securing their power base, amassing weapons, hiring mercenaries, and buying off influential people. But their actions didn't go unnoticed. Cinna was suspicious of Sulla and his motives, but he couldn't prove any wrongdoing, so he hesitated to act. All the while, Rome was being torn apart by civil war. From across the Italian peninsula, veteran soldiers were returning home, but instead of disbanding them, Sulla used them to bolster his personal army. Most of these soldiers were loyal to Marius, but some followed Sulla because they respected his ability as a general and because they despised the reforms Marius championed. Whatever their motivations, the result was clear. Rome was becoming a garrison state, and before long, the streets would run red with the blood of Romans. As tension increased between Sulla and Cinna, it became clear that a compromise was impossible. So Cinna left Rome with an army and established a base of operations in the south. Sulla was forced to do the same, moving to the city of Pisa. There, he raised more troops, specifically 3 legions made up entirely of freed slaves. These 3 legions would become the most important military force in Rome. Under Sulla's command, they fought through central Italy, defeating the Marian forces and forcing Cinna to flee to Egypt. But that was just the beginning, because now Sulla turned his attention to the eastern and there his fortunes took a turn. Despite having the backing of Rome's elites, Sulla struggled against the armies of King Mithridates, the 6th of Pontus. Rome's legions were a shadow of their former selves. They lacked supplies, logistics, and coordination. And somehow, despite his reputation as a brilliant commander, Sulla lost battle after battle against Mithridates. The turning point came when a Roman envoy arrived in Athens carrying orders from Cinna. These orders were simple: recall your legions immediately. Sulla didn't have enough power to fight Mithridates without the support of Rome, so he had to choose between his ambitions and his life. He chose neither. Instead, he seized the envoy and executed him, seizing his legions in the process. Sulla may have broken Roman law by killing an envoy, but that was the last thing on his mind. He was going to seize control of Rome, whether Cinna liked it or not. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters in Roman history. Sulla marched his legions west, devastating the countryside, sacking cities and murdering thousands of civilians. Everywhere he went, he left behind a legacy of terror and bloodshed. But eventually he arrived in Rome, and it was as if the gods themselves had parted the waters for him. All resistance crumbled before him. He took Cinna's prescriptions off the walls, arrested his supporters, confiscated their property, and sent them into exile. Some of Cinna's allies tried to flee Rome, but Sulla blocked their path, either killing them outright or forcing them into exile. Sulla was undisputed master of Rome, and his ambitions were far from over. But first, he needed to address the issue of kings. Italy might be under his control, but Rome was still locked in a bitter struggle against Mithridates. In fact, the war was worse than ever, because now the eastern provinces were arming themselves against Rome. Luckily for Sulla, he had a solution to this problem, and that solution was to create more kings. Tobit Akin Sulla reasoned, "You need to be king yourself." So he marched his legions east, bypassing Greece, where most of the fighting was happening. Instead, he headed south to Egypt and forcibly made Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy the kings and queens of a newly independent Egypt. From there, Sulla marched north to the Levant, where he repeated the process. First, he deposed King Aristarchus and made himself king of Syria. Then he did the same for King Alexander and his sister Bernice. Alexander's title, by the way, was pretty great. He was the king of the Hellenistic kingdom of Bithynia and Pontus. Sulla took all of that and condensed it down to one word: Bithynia. Now, the real reason he did this was to reassert Rome's dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. By installing puppet kings, Sulla could exert direct control over these kingdoms without having to occupy them. With that threat neutralized, he returned to Athens and prepared to crush Mithridates once and for all. Over the next few years, Sulla waged total war against Pontus. He laid siege to its cities, murdered its inhabitants, and crushed its armies. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted to conquer Anatolia, and in doing so, Sulla ended Rome's golden age forever. To hear how, stay tuned for more. Chapter 14. Death in Chapter 15. Tyranny will explore the collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. Check it out here on this channel. Thanks for watching. This has been Chapter 15. The death of Marius. But no matter how many times I revisit this story, it never gets easier. So, let's talk about that. Why is that? Why does this guy keep coming back to haunt me? And why, if you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, will you know that Marius died in 86 BC? But he looms so large over the next century of Roman history, which we are now going to spend the next 70-some-odd episodes exploring. What is it about this guy? We have killed him twice now. He's dead. Right? I mean, I hope so. But what is it about this guy that continues to make him such a big deal? Well, first off, he was ambitious. He wanted more out of life than his patrician birthright could offer him. He did not want to be just another cog in the machine. He didn't want to play by the rules. He wanted to break them. And when he found a way to do it, when he discovered the power of the populares, the commoners of Rome, he rode that wave all the way to the top, and he showed other Romans, men of all classes, that it could be done. It's possible. This is why there's so many parallels between Marius and Caesar. They both came from minor families with relatively small fortunes, although Caesar's was a bit larger than Marius, but still not anywhere near the top of the pile. They were both men who used their political skills and military genius to achieve greatness, to achieve power that no one thought they could possibly attain because they had no right, because they were not of the highest born. So Marius showed Caesar, and Caesar took that lesson and ran with it, quite literally running all the way from his province of Gaul into Italy at the head of an army to take over Rome itself. But it wasn't just Marius's own story that he affected. He also fundamentally changed the way the Roman Republic worked. Before Marius, the patricians had been able to keep most of the offices for themselves. Sure, there were plenty of non-patricians who had become consuls and even dictators before, but it was rare. It was almost unheard of. There were only a handful of non-patricians who had ever held the consulship before Marius came along. But once he got the ball rolling, once he cracked the door open, it couldn't be stopped. Not only did Marius himself go on to hold the consulship 7 times, more than any other person before or since, but he helped men like Gaius Gracchus and Lucius Appuleius Saturnius get into the consulship as well. These were men who could never have dreamed of that sort of thing happening before. Marius smashed that ceiling. He broke through it and made it clear to all Romans that office, power, glory, those things were up for grabs. It just depended on whether you were willing to fight for it. Of course, others did. Marius' enemies within the Senate, Sulla and Pompey, they went on to seize power themselves and to defeat Marius' faction. But even in defeat, he left his mark on Rome, because even after he was kicked out of the city and declared an enemy of the state, even after he fled to Africa in disgrace, he came back, he regrouped, and he kept fighting. And that led to civil war, which in turn led to Sulla conquering Italy and establishing the first dictatorship in Roman history. So even though Marius lost in the end, he still changed the nature of the Roman Republic forever. He set in motion the events that would lead to the rise of Caesar and Augustus and the end of the Republic. And what's more, he also revealed the weakness, the fundamental weakness of the system. If one man could throw it into chaos, if one man could nearly break it, then clearly it wasn't strong enough. So everyone who came after him, especially his enemies, they knew that they had to be cautious. They had to watch their backs. Because if they weren't careful, someone else might come along and seize all the power for themselves. The last reason why Marius continues to loom large over Rome is that he refused to stay dead. Okay, technically, I suppose I should say I refuse to keep killing him, because every time I sit down to write a new episode, he always shows up again. And don't ask me why. You think I enjoy spending so much time with this guy? He's grumpy and unpleasant. It smells bad. ADS. A lot. I don't like doing it. But he keeps coming back, and I think it's because deep down inside, despite all the horrible things he did, deep down inside, he was actually a good Roman. He wanted what was best for Rome. Even if he went about it the wrong way, he cared deeply about the people. He fought to protect them from exploitation and injustice. He marched into the social war and single-handedly saved Rome from destruction at the hands of her own allies. He defended the Republic against the most dangerous threats, and in doing so, he became the greatest general in Roman history. And yet, he also recognized the faults in the system, the ways in which it failed to protect those allies that he had just spent years defending. He saw how the Optimates exploited the poor, and he tried to help them. He wasn't perfect. No one ever is not in real life, certainly not in ancient Rome. But he was good, genuinely good. And it's that combination that continues to fascinate me. That combination of ruthless ambition and genuine concern for his fellow Romans. That's why he keeps coming back to haunt me. That's why he'll continue to loom large over Rome for decades to come. That's why even in defeat, he is still the greatest man in Rome. You know, maybe it's not so surprising that even centuries later, people still remember him. Now, where were we? Yes. Marius lies dying. His fever is finally abating, but he is weak and exhausted. It's the end of the road for him, and Cinna is here to make sure that he knows it. Cinna is Marius' henchman, his instrument of violence, the one who carried out the dirty work for him. But Cinna is conflicted. He likes Marius, respects him, admires him, but he knows that Marius is dangerous. In fact, he knows better than anyone how dangerous Marius really is. After all, he's the one who has suffered the consequences of Marius' actions. He's been beaten and tortured for his pains, and now he's come to say goodbye to his old master. Marius opens his eyes and sees the young man standing over him. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know that Cinna has been sent to kill him. And as he looks at the young man, he remembers another young man, a handsome youth who once came to him seeking advice, a man who would go on to become his greatest rival. And as he thinks about it, he realizes that he hasn't changed at all. He's still a force for disruption, a threat to the established order. And as he thinks about that, he feels pride, but it's a cold, empty feeling. Nothing like the warmth of Cinna's smile. Cinna leans down over the old general and whispers something in his ear, but Marius can't hear what he says. And slowly, imperceptibly, perhaps only in a dream, Marius begins to smile. Cinna steps back and watches the old man drift off to sleep. He feels a pang of sympathy for him, but he's done his duty. The Republic is safe now. And he turns and walks away. And so ends Chapter 15. As Marius drifts into the arms of Morpheus, I invite you, dear listener, to drift into sleep yourself. Let the gentle lull of my voice carry you away as we contemplate the amazing legacy of Gaius Marius, a man who, whether he knew it or not, changed the course of history forever. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to help us make history together, join our community on Patreon. Our patrons get access to exclusive content, including early access to ad-free episodes. New patrons get a free audiobook from our shop. You can find links to our support page and our shop in the description below. Thanks for listening. See you next time.